The Mississippi River. It divides two states. We live by it, and we play by it. But in just a few short days, things changed forever.
Well, in the past 24 hours, we've seen a little over an inch of rainfall.
Storm last night forced National Guardsmen to evacuate residents of the Garden Addition in Davenport.
The flood of 1993, 30 years later. Hello, I'm Chief Meteorologist Eric Maitland, along with Teresa Bryant. We're taking a look back at the flood of 1993, which in the Quad Cities hit a record crest of 22.63 feet on July 9th.
We'll explore the weather patterns that led up to the flood, how some of our TV6 staff experienced the flood, and we'll look at one of the iconic businesses on the literal front lines of the flood and how technology is being used to monitor Mississippi River flooding.
But it all starts with the wild card whenever we approach a potential flood.
Let's explore the weather patterns that led to the Great Mississippi River flood of 1993.
Well, if you're around the Quad Cities back in 1993, of course, you remember the Great Flood of 1993. How could you not remember it with the major impacts just outside our back door, right along the Mississippi River? Of course, the Great Flood of 1993 was greater than just in the Quad Cities. It affected portions of 9 states and 2 major American rivers, the Mississippi, the Missouri, and all of their major tributaries. Here's how things got their start back on the Missouri and Mississippi Basin in late 1992. Throughout the fall, there was a lot of heavy rain, some record rainfall levels, followed by heavy snow in the winter of 92-93. That resulted in soil moisture above average and reservoir levels above average. And then, of course, that was followed by the persistent and sometimes heavy rain that came during the spring and summer of 1993. Some of the effects of that heavy rain in Des Moines, the Des Moines and Raccoon River flooding, affected the water supply. You might have remembered that news video of people walking around town with their big plastic water jugs trying to find potable water sources. The sewage system there was damaged as well. In North Iowa, the Winnebago River caused intercity flooding in Mason City. Just off to our west, the Iowa River topped the Coralville Reservoir. And of course, here in the Quad Cities area, the Mississippi presented us with the highest water since 1965. Here was the weather setup for the Great Flood of 93. We had lingering cool air to the north and west, full of very showery conditions. Bone dry to the south and east. They had a drought in the southeastern United States with this hot, dry air that really didn't support any rain. Between these two air masses, a stationary front. Stationary relative to the air masses, because the air masses did wobble about, but that front stayed in between both of them. And as it did move, despite its name, it served as the focal point for much of the heavy rain as it moved across the flood zone. As a matter of fact, not only did we get the long-term rains out of that, but we also had thunderstorms along the way, which contributed with flash flooding. Now, from April 1st to August 31st, some areas that received normally 30 to 36 inches of rain got up to 48 inches of rain. Some areas got even more. Soil moisture hit capacity down to 6 feet. That's called field capacity. And get this, many areas had 20 or more days of rain in July versus an average of 8 to 9 days. And here's how that heavy rain set up. Most of the areas in light green here, about 1.5 times normal rain, twice as much rainfall as average in portions of northeast Iowa. And of course, this all drained into the Mississippi. That runoff was part of the reason we had such heavy flooding here in the QCA. But as that all moved south, that also took its toll on a lot of levees in Missouri and Springfield, breaching those and causing widespread flooding in some of those areas. So the flood of 93, it was a culmination of long-term abundant moisture from rain and snow, though not necessarily a snowmelt flood. And the flood of 93 also showed that summer flooding due to heavy rain could be repeated if all of those early factors come into play again.
Many in the QCA remember the flood of 93, including many of us here at TV6.
Meteorologist Kyle Dickens takes a look back with some of those who were here at TV6 reporting on the flood and what it was like being involved in one of the Mississippi River Valley's biggest events to ever occur.
The furious struggle to hold back powerful rising floodwaters. And now the president is coming to town to survey the damage.
The president is flying in on Sunday to tour the flood-ravaged areas. He's likely to check out many of the downtown Davenport businesses.
If you turned your television set on during the summer of 1993, chances are local and national news programs were mentioning the historic flood taking place in the Quad City area and areas along the Mississippi River. Well, that was no exception here at TV6.
TV6 News Today. Residents were forced from their homes overnight because of rising flood waters. This after torrential downpours once again hit the Quad City area.
TV6's Marsha Lenz recalls the gravity of the ever-evolving story.
It was certainly the longest story that had, been covered in my time here. Really, I was actually reflecting on the apartment building collapse and how that was evolving on a daily basis and how much we were covering it. And it was the same kind of thing where, something you cover that's obvious, and then the next step is, oh, there's still something over here, and oh, here's another impact. And so there was just endless things happening, and you couldn't cover them all.
Our Sharon DeReek is there, and she joins us now live with more. Sharon, what's it like at the scene?
Well, Marcia, other than the sounds of the sump pumps right now, it's relatively quiet down here. As you can see, many of the business owners in this area already have their sandbags in place.
As Marsha recalls, the flood of 1993 was a very lengthy story, one that had many angles, many communities involved, and people affected, and one that seemed to never end.
We knew the trouble was brewing, was the weather. It would just rain. Every 3 days we would get another rainfall, but it wasn't just an inch of rain or half inch of rain. It was heavy rain, 1, 2, 3 inches of rain, and then 3 days later another 2 inches of rain. And so you could see that this was a problem.
Well, in the past 24 hours, we've seen a little over an inch of rainfall, and that's just out of that one storm that blew through our area.
That's a lot of rain.
Some really
A flood like that, as we know in this community, but we really didn't know at that time because there hadn't been anything like it since 1965. And so most modern memory was nobody really knew what to expect. And so it was that kind of slow rise that you knew something was coming and it potentially could get worse, that we just saw that kind of building of sandbag walls and trying to push the water back, and the water kept rising, and you kept saying, well, okay, I guess we got to raise these sandbags a little higher, these walls a little higher. For me, there was one family business in downtown Davenport where they were trying to protect their store. It was a flooring business, and they were on watch 24/7. So we kept checking on them to see how their flood fight was going.
In 30 years, a lot has changed in our communities, and a lot has changed in how our communities handle floods.
There have been so many floods since that, we've evolved and we've gotten better at it. And of course, the HESCO barriers really do a much better job of holding back the river than just a man-made sandbag wall, which we still use, but we know that they have their limits.
With all the changes in 30 years, the one thing that hasn't changed is how powerful Mother Nature and the mighty Mississippi can be. Meteorologist Kyle Dickens, TV6 News.
During the flood of 1993, TV6 covered many stories about the businesses impacted by the worst flood in history at the time.
Meteorologist Kyle Keel takes us to one of those businesses still running strong today, Front Street Brewery, and how the owners have adapted to flooding since then, including the most recent one earlier this year.
Front Street Brewery has been a staple on Davenport's River Drive since 1992. Just months after opening, the mighty Mississippi forced the original owners, Steve and Jenny, to close the brew pub.
They had just gotten into this business in mid-1992, and I think they poured their life savings into it. And in 1993, they were devastated with the complete loss of business, the brewing equipment, the facilities, and so forth.
Current co-owner Tim Baldwin acquired Front Street in 2016 and knew what he and his business partner were up against.
I'm a pilot, and so I do recall going up and taking some aerial footage, took some photographers up at the time and did some aerial footage all over the area, including downtown Davenport, but didn't have any real connection to downtown Davenport at the time.
We showed Baldwin this footage from the TV6 archive showing the extent of the water in Front Street's basement.
Seeing that video, it was very recognizable to me that it was our basement. Different that there was brewing equipment there, but that cooler that you showed me in the 93 flood video is the same cooler we have in the basement today. And that survived the 93 flood and it survived the 2019 flood. So it was very reminiscent of what we were dealing with the day that the wall finally breached, because we were down there pumping water to make sure it didn't look like that. And then hours later, it was that and more when the wall finally breached.
Today, the brewing equipment lives in the tap room at the Freight House. The basement of the brew pub now houses a kitchen area, office space, and a dining area for private parties. The flood of 93 is a talker among customers every once in a while.
We certainly have some long-term customers that were around and actually helped sandbag in 1993. And one of our most popular beers, Raging River, came out of the 93 flood as a thank you to all those that helped sandbag. The previous owner, Steve Zeidema, brewed that beer, called it Raging River for good reason, and it's still a popular beer today.
So popular, in fact, that it's on special anytime the Mississippi River rises over its banks. In the front of the brew pub lives two marks showing the height of the water in 1993 and the highest flood on record, 2019.
We have it marked on our wall, as do we have the 2019 level marked on our wall, so yeah, that's our gauge.
Recent flood mitigations by the brew pub and the city allow business to continue during flooding.
Now our biggest challenge is just making sure that people understand we're open. It's difficult with the walls up, just getting around downtown, finding places to park.
However, despite the challenges each flood brings, Front Street remains resilient. In Davenport, Kyle Keel, TV6 News.
It's amazing to see how we as a community have survived and recovered from floods over these years, and to see how flood protection has become essential in protecting a lot of our communities who call home along the mighty Mississippi.
Meteorologist Kevin Phelps shows us how science and technology has evolved over the years, especially when it comes to measuring river levels.
Living in the QCA, we're no strangers to hearing flood stages and river levels, but have you ever stopped to think, how are those actually measured and why it's not exactly what you think? I headed over to Lock and Dam 15, got the lowdown on how we measure the river and how those flood stages are set.
Didn't move my trailer because I thought it was set up a foot above 65, and that was supposed to have been the mother of all floods, and it wasn't.
Knowing the river levels at certain points along the Mississippi is crucial for city responses and preparedness, whether it's for rises or drops. So as you can imagine, it's constantly being monitored.
Each lock and dam has a well. There's one on the upstream side of the dam, that's the pool. There's one on the downstream side of the dam that's called the tailwater. And there's separate systems that measure the water levels upstream and downstream of the dam.
The river is measured in a couple different ways, one involving pressure.
So this is what we call a submersible pressure sensor. This is fixed down into the water, and it just senses how much water is above it and is able to track how that water level changes over time.
The other option includes what is essentially a tape measure.
So this is more of a mechanical sensor that we have. So you actually put a measuring tape on here, and it has little pins you can see, so the tape has holes that it's held on there, so if the river's moving quickly, the tape will stay on the wheel. There's a weight and a float on here, a counterweight and a float, so when the water level goes up and down, it spins this wheel and then changes the reading on this digital readout.
Now the height measurements aren't exactly what you think. The sensors are at all fixed points or depth, meaning the river is likely deeper than the, quote, height, unquote, you see on river level maps.
The stages that you see published on websites and that are mentioned, those are really arbitrary numbers. They don't give you an idea of how deep the water is or what the elevation of the water is. They're just arbitrary numbers that are linked back to a real-world elevation using what is called a gauge zero, which is unique to each site.
Flood stages are all set based on each river level location and local impacts at certain predetermined levels.
Really went away. By May 25th, the Mississippi had risen to the 9th highest crest on record, nearly 4 feet above flood stage. And then came June, the wettest one on record, over a foot of rain in 30 days.
As you can imagine, in the last 30 years, there's been much more data available to us, with measurements essentially taken every minute, but the overall way we measure the river hasn't really changed a whole lot.
I'd say the big changes is how the data is gathered. It's collected via satellite much more frequently than it was in '93. There were a number of gauges added, especially throughout Iowa. After the '93 flood, I think the number of gauges doubled or quadrupled just because the support from the state and other local agencies was there. And we're still using a lot of those gauges today.
Each gauge has multiple redundancies put in, including someone coming and checking every couple hours and reporting the measurement, just like the old days. But the biggest lesson from 1993 was communication between all the offices that monitor the river levels.
You can see the flood coming from, before it gets there, basically, like it was in '93. I would say another thing that's really improved is just the cooperation amongst the agencies. So we maintain gauges, the United States Geological Survey maintains gauges, and we're able to share that through that satellite collection system. It's a really nice system, and everybody gets the data at the same time, all the water level management decision makers.
River levels are monitored year-round. That does include even during the winter when we see a lot of ice chunks flowing down the Mississippi. Now that does take some extra maintenance. Those wells where we take our measurements are actually warmed by a heat lamp so we don't see things ice over, and that allows us to continue to get those measurements essentially every minute, 365 days a year. I'm meteorologist Kevin Phelps for KWQC First Alert Weather.
Since 1993, many improvements have been made to prevent flooding in some areas, possibly at the risk of more flooding to places downstream. And in the Quad Cities, there's only been one crest higher than the 22.63 feet of 1993. And that was the all-time record crest in 2019 of 22.7 feet. The 1993 flood beat the previous record from 1965, a record that stood for 28 years.
It took 26 years for the crest of 1993 to be topped. Those of us with river interest would be happy to wait much longer than that for the next great flood on the Mississippi River, be it from heavy rain or snowmelt. Of course, only Mother Nature knows when the next record crest will occur. For Teresa Bryant, I'm Eric Maitland. Thank you for joining us.